The auctioneer started at $40,000, then 30, then 20, then 10. There were 200 people standing in that yard, and not one hand went up. He went down to $500 for a running truck with current plates that was worth better than $40,000, and the woman standing in the front row, whose husband had owned it, raised her hand. And nobody in that yard bid $1 over her. Stay with me all the way to the end of this one, because the last 5 minutes are about Iowa in 1933 and about a 19-year-old boy who stood in a crowd just like that one, and about his grandson. Let me start with the auctioneer, because he's the one who told me this. Ren Coburn is 58 years old, and he has been an auctioneer for 31 years. Farm equipment, mostly. Estate sales. Dispersals when somebody retires or dies or gives it up. And repossessions, which is the part of the job nobody likes and everybody in his line does, because that's the work. And he told me something at the start that I want you to have in your head for the whole rest of this, because it's how he sees himself. He said an auctioneer doesn't get an opinion. He said, I sell the farm and I sell it to the fella buying it. I'm not the bank and I'm not the family. I'm the loudest voice in the room, and that's the whole job. He stood in a lot of yards where people were crying. He sold a man's equipment while the man watched. He says you learn to keep the rhythm and get through it, because slowing down doesn't make it kinder, it just makes it longer. 900 auctions, give or take. He talks about one. Now let me tell you why that truck was being sold, and I'm going to be careful about it, because the easy version of this story has a villain in it, and the real version doesn't. Nolan Ryman was 61 years old. Owner-operator, 34 years, running mostly regional out of a small yard behind his own house. He died in October. Heart attack, in that yard, on a Tuesday afternoon, and he was gone before anybody got to him. His truck was a 2016 Peterbilt with about 600,000 miles on it, and it was in good shape because Nolan Ryman was the kind of man who kept a truck in good shape. There was a lien on it. Calder Bank and Trust, a regional bank with about 11 branches. Commercial equipment note. The payoff balance was $9,400. The truck was worth north of $40,000. Now, his widow, Nolan Ryman, 59 years old, offered to pay the $9,400. She had it. Not easily, but she had it. She went into a branch with a folder, and she offered to clear the note in full. And she was told she couldn't. I want to explain this properly because when I first heard it I assumed somebody was being cruel, and that isn't what happened. The note was in her husband's name, secured against titled commercial equipment. She was not on it. And under that bank's policy, a surviving spouse could not simply pay off and take title on a commercial equipment note. The obligation had to either be assumed, which required her to qualify on her own income and credit, or the collateral had to be liquidated and the proceeds applied. She did not qualify. She works part-time at a school district office. So the answer was no. Not no, you can't pay. No, this is not a payoff situation. This is a liquidation. Every person in that chain followed the policy correctly. There is no memo anywhere with somebody being nasty in it. I looked, and the outcome of everybody doing their job correctly was that a woman who was standing there holding $9,400 was going to lose a $40,000 truck. The auction was set for the 6th of December at 10 in the morning on site, meaning in the gravel yard behind the Ryman house, which is where the truck was. Ren Coburn got there at 9:15, and the first thing that struck him was the parking. There were vehicles on both shoulders of that county road for a good distance in both directions. Pickups mostly, and then trucks, actual tractors, some bobtail, some with trailers, parked up wherever there was room. He assumed he'd gotten the address wrong, or that something else was happening nearby. By 9:30, there were maybe 80 people standing in that yard. By 9:50, there were over 200. They came from 3 states. He knows that now because he asked afterward and because he saw the plates. And the thing that Ren Coburn cannot get past, more than a year later, is that they were quiet. There were no signs. Nobody had made a banner. There was no chanting, no speeches, nobody standing on anything. There was no organizer with a clipboard. 200 people stood in a gravel yard in December and talked quietly among themselves and waited. Ren says his first thought was that this was a protest and that he should call somebody. His second thought, about a minute later, was that he had no idea what he'd be calling anybody about, because nobody was doing anything. They were standing on private property with the widow's permission at a publicly noticed auction. There was one other person there who didn't understand what she was looking at. Michelle Ackerley was in her 30s and she worked in asset recovery for Calder Bank and Trust. She was there because somebody from the bank had to be there. She had been at maybe a dozen of these. Usually there are 8 people. Sometimes there are 3. Ren says he watched her get out of her car, look around that yard, and go very still. If you have ever seen people show up for somebody without being asked and without making a speech about it, then stay with me. Subscribe if you believe the strongest thing a crowd can do is sometimes nothing at all. And tell me down in the comments about the time strangers stood up for you. I read every single one. 10 o'clock. Ren Coburn got up on the flatbed trailer he uses as a stand, because you need height, and he did what he does. He read the terms. Cash or certified funds, day of sale, as is where is, title to be transferred by the lien holder. He read the lot description. He identified the vehicle. And then he opened. He started at 40,000, which is what you do. You start high and you come down until somebody bites, and usually you're only coming down for a few seconds. 40,000. He'll give me 40. Nothing. He says that's normal. 40 was ambitious and he knew it. So he moved. 35. 35,000. He'll start me at 35. Nothing. 30. Give me 30. 28. 25. Nothing. And this is where Ren Coburn says he first felt something in his stomach, and I want to be precise about what it was, because it wasn't fear. It was that 200 people were looking at that truck. Not at each other. Not at their phones. Not at him. Every person in that yard was looking directly at the truck, and nobody was moving, and nobody was blinking, and there was no sound at all. He said, an auction is never quiet. Ever. There's always noise. People talk. Kids run around. Somebody's tailgate is down. Somebody's on the phone. There's a dog. In 31 years, he had never once stood in front of a crowd that made no sound. 20,000. 20. 15. 15,000 for a running truck, folks. Nothing. 10. $10,000. Nothing. He says by then he had stopped doing the patter. The chant, the rhythm, all of that requires somebody to be bidding, and he was just talking now into a wall. 5,000. $5,000. That's a giveaway, and you all know it. Nothing. 2,000. 1,000. Nothing. Somebody give me $500 for a running truck. And then, from the back, a hand went up. His name was Rand Vale. He was in his 40s. He ran a small used truck lot about 300 miles away, and he had driven up that morning because he'd seen the listing. He knew nothing. He hadn't spoken to anybody in that county. He did not know whose truck it was, or that there was a widow standing 30 feet in front of him. He saw a $2,000 bid go unanswered on a Peterbilt, and he thought, correctly, professionally, that something had gone strange, and he was about to have the best day of his year. He bid 5,000. And Ren Coburn says the entire yard turned around. Not fast. Not aggressively. 200 people simply turned, more or less at the same time, and looked at the man who had raised his hand. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved toward him. Ren says his hand went toward the gavel, because 31 years tells you when something is about to happen, and he had decided he was going to shut it down and get everybody off that property. And then an old man came out of the crowd. He was 74 years old. He walked over to Rand Vale, took his time about it, because he wasn't quick on his feet, and he stood in front of him and talked to him for about 2 minutes. Quietly. Ren was 30 feet away and up on a trailer, and he did not hear one word of it. Neither did anybody else. Rand Vale has never repeated it, and I asked him. And Rand Vale listened. And then he nodded. And then he said, out loud, so Ren could hear him, I withdraw. Now here's the part of this that I keep coming back to, and it's the reason I believe every word of this story. Rand Vale did not leave. He had been in that yard 11 minutes. He'd driven 3 hours. He'd just given up what he thought was a $35,000 margin. And he did not go back to his truck. He walked into the crowd and stood there with everybody else and watched the rest of it. He stayed until it was over. He's the one who told me the part about the silence sounding wrong. Actually, he said he'd never heard anything like it either. Ren Coburn took a second, and then he started again. $500. And Nolan Ryman raised her hand. 500, from the lady in front. Do I hear 6? Nothing. Do I hear 550? Nothing. Do I hear 510? And here is the thing that Ren Coburn did that I think is the most professional thing in this entire story. He waited. He said he stood up there and gave it a full 40 seconds, which in an auction is an eternity, a genuinely uncomfortable, obviously deliberate amount of time. He did that because it was his job. If there was anybody in that crowd who wanted to bid and was hesitating, they were going to get every possible opportunity to do it, because Ren Coburn was not going to be part of chilling an auction. That's his license and his name. He said, I gave him every chance. I'd do it the same way again. Nobody wanted it. 40 seconds of 200 people saying nothing. Then he brought the gavel down. Sold. $500. And nobody cheered. That's the detail he always comes back to. No applause, no whooping, nobody hugging anybody. 200 people just started walking back to their vehicles. He said it took about 20 minutes for that county road to clear out, and it was the quietest thing he's ever been part of. Now let me tell you what happened a week before. His name is Alden Poe. He's 74 years old. He drove for 41 years out of that same county, and he retired in 2014. He heard about the auction the way anybody in a place like that hears about anything, which is at a cafe. So he drove over and talked to Nolan Ryman. He asked her 2 questions. What's the payoff, and what's the truck worth? $9,400. And better than 40. And Alden Poe went home and started making phone calls. There was no organization. There was no Facebook group. He isn't on it. There were no flyers, no group text, no meeting. He did not talk to a lawyer, and he did not talk to a reporter. He called people on the telephone, one at a time, and he said 3 things. The first was, come to the auction. The second was, don't bid. And the third was, if somebody from outside starts bidding, come get me. I'll talk to them. That's it. That's the entire plan. 22 phone calls. And those 22 made calls of their own, and it moved the way things move in that industry, which is by CB and by cafe counter and by one driver telling another at a fuel island. But here's the part of Alden Poe's plan that I think is the actual genius of it, and it's the third thing he said. He did not tell anybody what to say to an outside bidder. He specifically did not. He told them to come and get him. Because he understood, at 74, that if 20 people improvised 20 different conversations with a stranger, one of those conversations was going to go wrong. Somebody was going to get heated. Somebody was going to say something that could be called a threat, and then the whole thing becomes a police matter and a lawsuit, and Nolan Ryman ends up worse off than she started. So he made himself the only person authorized to have that conversation. One man, 74 years old, deliberately putting himself in the only position with any legal exposure in the whole thing. He told Ren afterward, if it was going to land on somebody, it was going to land on me. I'm done working. What are they going to do? Fire me. Ren Coburn went and found Alden Poe about 2 months later because he could not let it go. And he asked him where he'd gotten the idea. And Alden Poe said, it's not my idea. It's my granddad's. And it wasn't his either. In 1933, in Iowa, farms were being foreclosed at a rate that is difficult to imagine now. Whole counties. Sheriff sales every week, sometimes several in a day. And farmers started showing up at them. They'd fill the yard. And when the auctioneer opened, nobody would bid. Or somebody would bid a nickel, and then nobody would bid over it. And the farm and the equipment would sell for a few dollars and get handed straight back to the family that had just lost it. They called them penny auctions. Some places called them Sears Roebuck sales. It happened hundreds of times across the Midwest in 1932 and 1933. It's in the historical record. Some states eventually passed foreclosure moratoriums partly because of it. Alden Poe's grandfather was named Orrin Poe, and he stood in 3 of those crowds in Iowa in 1933. He was 19 years old. And when Alden Poe was about 12, his grandfather told him about it. Once, not as a lesson, just as a thing that had happened when he was young. And he said one sentence that Alden Poe has carried for 62 years. He said, you don't have to break the law, son. You just have to not open your mouth. That's the whole technique. That's why it works. Nothing illegal happened in that gravel yard in December. The auction was properly noticed and properly conducted by a licensed auctioneer who gave every bidder every opportunity. The property sold to the highest bidder present. The highest bidder present was $500 because 200 people chose to stand there and say nothing. You cannot compel a person to bid. There is no law that requires a man who drove 3 states to open his mouth. Now let me tell you what it cost them, because it wasn't free and nobody ever says that part. Ren tried to work it out afterward. Most of those people took a day off work. December 6th was a Friday. A lot of them were owner-operators or company drivers, which means a day not driving is a day not earning. There's no such thing as paid leave for most of that room. The ones who came from 3 states away paid their own fuel to get there and back. And there was at least one man who ran a load late because of it and took a written warning for it at his company. Ren only found that out secondhand, months later, from somebody else. The man himself never mentioned it to anybody, and Ren has never learned his name. But here is the detail that changes the whole shape of this for me, and I've saved it deliberately. Ren Coburn spent about 3 months afterward talking to people who'd been in that yard. Not formally, he'd just ask when he ran into somebody. And what he found out is that most of those 200 people did not know Nolan Ryman. Not knew of him, did not know him. A lot of them had never heard the name before that week. They didn't come because of who he was. They came because of what he was, a 59-year-old widow standing in a gravel yard holding $9,400 she wasn't allowed to hand over. And because every single one of them knew, in a way that people in that line of work know it in their bones, that it could be their wife standing there. Here's where everybody ended up. Calder Bank and Trust had no recourse. None. The auction was valid, it was properly conducted, and the sale stood. They applied $500 against a $9,400 note and wrote off the difference. They did not sue anybody, and to their credit, they didn't try. There was nothing to sue over. And about 6 months later, they quietly changed a policy. A surviving spouse can now pay a commercial equipment note to zero and clear the lien without new underwriting. They didn't announce it. Ren found out because he asked somebody. Michelle Ackerley doesn't work there anymore. She left about a year later, and it wasn't related, as far as anybody knows. Ren walked out to the road with her that morning, after the crowd cleared. And she said one thing to him before she got in her car. She said, "I'm here to do the job I'm supposed to do. But I'm glad it didn't work." Nolan Ryman owns that truck outright. She can't drive it. She doesn't have a CDL, and she's not going to get one at 59. There's a young man named Silas Trout who was in that yard that morning. He was 24. He was one of the ones who did not know Nolan Ryman and had never heard the name. He drives that truck now. He leases it from Laureen and pays her every month, and it's an arrangement that works for both of them. The name on the door still says Ryman. He hasn't changed it, and he says he isn't going to. And Randvale, the dealer who bid $5,000 and then withdrew and then stood in the crowd for the rest of it, calls Nolan Ryman every December. He has done it every year since. He doesn't have a good explanation for it. When I asked him, he said, "I don't know. I was there." Calder Bank and Trust looked at a gravel yard in December and saw a piece of titled collateral that had to be liquidated, and every single person in that chain did their job correctly. Ren Coburn has called 900 auctions and talks about one. Some people stand up for somebody by making noise about it. And some people take a Friday off, drive 3 states, stand in the cold on somebody else's gravel for an hour, and say absolutely nothing at all, because saying nothing was the only thing that was going to work, and because a 19-year-old in Iowa figured that out in 1933 and told his grandson about it once. 40,000 down to 500, Nolan. And most of them didn't even know your name.